Hello, I'm John Grom, and welcome to our 168th Right and Left Discussion Forum. We hold our televised discussions twice monthly to demonstrate the value of civil, productive, open-minded political dialogue. Today, our panel will discuss the behavior and performance of the major media during and after the recent presidential election. Today's panel opens with Bryan Laubaugh, President of R&D Financial Services, Patty Haskins, member of the Wadsworth City Council, Joe Gaines, former member of the faculty of the University of Akron and Wadsworth High School, and Dr. Ronald Chamberlin, retired senior research chemist. Bryan, in a recent and still ongoing presidential election, it seems as though the major media outlets have been under as much scrutiny as the candidates for their coverage of the election. What are your thoughts on how well the public was served by the media during and after the presidential campaign?
Well, I think the media outdid themselves this time around. They've managed to waste any sort of credibility that they ever had with the public. I think the legacy media, NBC, CBS, ABC, New York Times, the Washington Post, they went all in as far as my view of doing everything they could to make Donald Trump out to be the worst possible guy. Some even compared him to Hitler. What we're seeing now is that people are getting their news off of social media. And I think you're going to see a flight from people actually watching and subscribing to newspapers like the New York Times and the Washington Post. Unfortunately, when people do that, they go to websites that are like Colbert or Bill Maher, and which actually are parody, as my opinion is, they're parody news organizations, and people actually believe that. I think the last time you saw the news start to change years and years ago, when Walter Cronkite went after Lyndon Baines Johnson and had the death toll of the soldiers that lost their lives or missing in action or wounded in action during the Vietnam War. And if you read anything about LBJ, he attributes that to one of the factors why he decided not to run. And it's only gotten worse. I'm just finishing up a book by John Adams. And when John Adams and Thomas Jefferson were running, the major newspapers called them everything that you can possibly imagine in the day: scoundrels, traitors, wife abusers, you name it. But with social media and the megaphone of social media, all those things carry, and they carry a great distance. What's been really shocking to me is the censorship that Facebook and Twitter and some of these organizations that consider themselves platforms for free discussion undertook. Jack Dorsey, the creator and major owner of Twitter, has admitted that his organization basically censored information that was damaging to the Joe Biden campaign, and that was the Hunter Biden laptop. And if you remember, they pulled down the Washington Post, which I believe is the second or third largest newspaper in circulation in the country, had a story, a very well-sourced story, a credible story that they'd been working on about Hunter Biden. And when it hit Twitter and hit social media, Twitter swung into action, and they actually pulled it down, and they blocked the Washington Post from using their platform. And that was several weeks. They might say, oh, they made a mistake, they put it back up again. But I think it was at least 2 or 3 weeks before the Washington Post could actually post something, because Twitter told them that they had to rescind the story for them to get back on their platform. We're seeing, and this is a detriment to any, conservatives, liberals, progressives. It's shocking that we allow organizations like Facebook, Mark Zuckerberg, Google has they have video of folks from the last election with Google crying that they couldn't do more to get Hillary Clinton elected. Now, I don't know how you refute video. To me, that's like gold. When you're head of, when you have one of the heads of your departments at Google crying that they should have done more because, Hillary Clinton didn't get elected, that to me speaks volumes. What's disappointing also is that for the last 4 years, we heard nothing but the Russians were involved in our election, and they took that so far as to use it as sort of a premise to impeach the president, and that was all media driven. And when you look at that, and when the story is told and history looks back on this particular point in time, I don't believe the mainstream media will be able to salvage any sort of credibility whatsoever for where they've taken their bias. To me, it was just amazing that they were able to print and say and amplify these messages about a particular individual, a particular party. So they're up pretty low on my book as far as how they acted and reacted to different stories. A little side note, now you're seeing people from Politico, people from the major news networks are now taking positions in Joe Biden's staff and as part of his transition team. So I think that also, that does happen, but I think objectivity has gone out the window when we deal with the media at this point.
Patty, what are your thoughts?
Well, first of all, I want to correct something that Bryan said. You talked about the Washington Post and having their Twitter account on Joe Biden being blocked. It was not the Washington Post, it was the New York Post, which is a Rupert Murdoch
Thank you.
publication.
Thank you. Appreciate that.
So,
Correct.
yeah, big difference in that.
But the New York Post is still the third largest newspaper by circulation.
Right, and it is very right-leaning.
Yeah.
It is not an unbiased publication. And that particular tweet concerning Joe Biden, the concern was the authenticity of it. And the argument is that any news publication should be able to print fabricated or untruthful statements and not be, and it is a good argument, should not be censored because it is a public platform. Just as right now Donald Trump can put out on Twitter consistently that I won the election and alluding to all kinds of fraud that does not exist and feels that that's okay. My big concern with that, of course, is that is spiking up the emotions within the country so as to not trust our election process and to make it appear as though it is not legal. With a minor note that the Trump organization is only going after states where Trump lost, saying there's fraud, but of course there's no fraud where he won and nothing to examine there. Going back though to how media has handled the election and before and after, I mean, it's without a doubt, we have right-leaning stations, we have liberal stations, we also have conservative networks. I mean, if you watch Fox News recently, they are very right-leaning, which is their choice to do so.
Can you name another one besides Fox, Patty?
OAN.
What's that?
One America News.
Oh, big time network, huh?
Actually, they are quite well known on the conservative circle. As a matter of fact, the reporter for OAN, if you'd watched over the past year at all of the press briefings, whether they were with the president or with Kayleigh McEnany or any other press result, because of COVID, only a certain number of reporters from various networks were allowed within the room to ask questions. And so they went on a rotating basis, with the exception of OAN, which by Trump's decree was in there at every single press briefing and was called on every single time, usually the last question, so they could end with a pro-Trump question. I watched those press briefings religiously, and it happened every time. Again, whether you watch MSNBC or Fox or OAN, or whether you watch CBS, there is a definite slant, and that's unfortunate. News used to be, these are the facts, and you have to decide. We've gone away from that, particularly in the evening hours where it is totally opinion. It's like reading a newspaper and only reading the editorials without reading any of the reporting that's actually being done. I still think that you can get a decent idea of what's going on, though, if you watch both sides of the news. If you look at right-leaning stations and left-leaning stations, for me, one of the best sources during the election itself on reporting was watching MSNBC, and not the normal announcers, but rather Steve Kernicki, who was doing the reporting of how the election was going on. This guy was great. I think I like him because he deals in facts with numbers and math, and that's kind of my thing. He would report how the election was going. He'd say, this is how many votes are still out. This particular precinct has been going 60% for this candidate, 40% for this candidate. Therefore, if for President Trump to win this, he has to get this many votes. For Biden to win this county, he has to get this many votes. He had the facts from 2016, so you could compare them. And you could really get a sense of how the election was going. So there is, I think, good reporting still going on. I just feel that we as viewers of these stations and viewers of social media have to have an open mind and look at everything so that we can get a good idea of what's going on and be able to weed through what is simply hype and unfactual statements and what is actually the truth and what's going on. As we all know, in politics, there's always a little bit of slant, and politicians are famous for not answering questions, but rather when posed with the question, simply divert to what they want to say or hedge on a question so as to not give a definitive yes or no answer.
At one time, we thought that National Public Radio and Television was going to be that one source of true, unbiased information. I don't think it worked that way, but it still could.
Yeah, and I agree. I think there are, and I guess it depends upon what person you're watching. NPR definitely, in my mind, has a left-leaning slant. But again, for every left-leaning publication out there or website, there's also a right-leaning station or website that you can watch and get a totally different view. So it's not for lack of knowledge.
Wouldn't it be wonderful if we had a news source that was neither left or right?
Right, and this is the way it used to be. Now, you know that those
I want to go back and visit that question toward the end here, but Joe, what are your thoughts?
Can I just quickly add real quick before I forget this?
Sure.
There's no pushback anymore when it comes to interviewing candidates or other than if it's, the people that they hate, then there's always screaming and yelling and pushback. But I was listening to an interview with an individual on NPR the other day, and I was surprised that the reporter just sat there and listened to to this individual say some of the most hateful things about Republicans, about conservatives, about Donald Trump. It was to me shocking that the reporter on NPR would not push back and say, "Oh, hold on a second here."
Have you watched the interviews Trump on Fox?
No, I haven't because I try
It's
to.
the same thing. It's the
I try to
exact
watch a
same
bunch
thing.
of different news things, but when someone says something so vitriolic that Republicans need to pay and we need to ferret out and find these people and drag them out into the street and ruin their lives, and the reporter doesn't say anything, you know, that to me, I mean, where's the reporting at?
Again,
where's
watch
the
interviews with
So
Donald
I just wanted to
Trump
put
on
that out
Fox,
there. I'm
so-
sorry to.
Okay,
I'm sorry to,
I think we ought to hear from Joe before he falls asleep. Joe, your
Unmute
mic's
Joe.
not on.
Lower left. There you go.
How's that?
Okay, great.
Well, my point is that I disagree completely with Bryan and I agree with Patty.
Oh, big surprise, Joe.
Well, the reason is that because I think most of the problems that Trump has, he's caused himself with the media. I mean, if you're going to be negative about Trump, how can you not be? I mean, he comes out, you know, did he win the election? No, but he doesn't care. In many cases, I think Trump is causing his own problems with the media, and not the media. And media just reports what he says. I don't believe that the media is wrong. I believe more or less that what we are reporting has to be more intelligent by us in what we read and what we go into. We've got to look into things. We got to make up our minds. We've got to make decisions as people, and we don't. We want to be convinced, and they can't convince us in many cases because, well, I'm a Democrat and I'm not going to accept anything that's anti-Democrat. Well, that's not right. I've got to read and figure out things. Do I really need to know about Joe Biden's son? No. I want to know about Joe Biden. I want to know where he stood. I want to know why he should be elected or shouldn't have been elected. But Trump, I don't know. I mean, he bothers me to no end, as obviously one can tell. I think he's
Are you bothered, Joe, are you bothered by the results of his policies or his personality?
That's a good question. Both. I don't agree with his policies, but I could live with those policies. I didn't agree with McCain's policies, but I could have lived with them because I liked McCain, because I trusted McCain. I don't trust Trump. I don't think he's telling the truth half the time. I think in many cases he's exaggerating. I think his personality comes through, which is not good.
Okay, well, Ron, you're up.
Unmute
Ron did
Ron.
fall. Pardon me?
There we go. Everybody so far has pretty much summarized my feelings. I've mentioned this before. I watch very little television and watch very few videos on this. I find it difficult with my age and slow mental capacity going on here to follow quickly enough to realize what's truth and what isn't in a video. As Bryan said something about a video is very, very persuasive, very hard to judge on. So basically I read, and like Joe, I try to read many places. My main sources, I look at the local paper every day. I subscribe to the Washington Post, and I watch a couple of columnists online, like for example, Dan Rather. Now these are liberal, but the Washington Post has a couple of columnists that I read religiously. One is Jonah Goldberg, and one is George Will. Both these certainly lean progressive, or lean conservative. And by the way, Goldberg has a very excellent anti-Trump message in today's Beacon Journal, if you want to pick that up and read it. So again, I find it's really difficult to figure out what's going on. You do have to really puzzle and think. A few occasional network news things I do watch, and I don't really watch PBS much anymore, really. Again, they are liberal slanted, and that's fine. I'm slanted liberal myself, and that's okay. But the difficulty is sussing out what's the facts of the matter and what is the interpretation of the matter. And as Bryan mentioned, increasingly, even the main TV news and print media as well blur that line considerably in most cases. So it's really tough. But I'm finding if I try to look at publications and commentators from various sides of this, that sometimes you can zero in on what hopefully will be the truth, and it's my process, and it's just really difficult to do, and I think it's becoming increasingly so. Somebody mentioned Walter Cronkite, and I mean there was a mensch, and John Cameron Swayze, and some of those other guys, and back in the 50s and 60s who just told it what it was, and you can draw your own conclusions. If they have a commentator to come on after it, he would come on and give some interpretation, but it's tough to find that. It's tough to find it. But again, the facts are there, and they get reported in various ways, and eventually I think the facts can coalesce on the truth, and then it's up to you to make your own decision about them. And by the way, Joe, I surely agree with you about Trump.
One of the questions
And
that I
comment.
have is, are we headed toward an increasingly intense set of warring factions in this country? Are we ever going to fulfill that dream of being one America?
Closer than we are, but that's got to deal a lot with the President of the United States, not with Trump. No, I don't
So
think.
you think that everything is
But I
going
wanted
to
to
be
make a
fine now
comment
that
that-
Biden has been elected?
No, I don't think it'll be fine, but I think it'll be better. I think for one thing is his personality does work more towards compromise. We're not compromising anymore. We're not trying to work together. You
That's
know,
a good
Democrats
point.
are right, Republicans are wrong. That's how we look at things. And we shouldn't. We've got to, in many cases, compromise and give each other a shot at finding the truth. You know, if you turn on the radio, you don't hear much about politics. What you hear is sports. And in many cases, we're talking more about sports nowadays than we are about politics. And we know more about what's going on in the world in sports than we do politics and the government. And I think that's one of the problems that we have, is that we are more for entertainment values than we are for factual information. I get a magazine called The Weekly, or The Week, and I really enjoy it because it's got articles in there from different countries, different journalists, and it gives you different viewpoints. And I think that's important. Just like what Ronald was saying, you know, George Will is very conservative, but he's not very pro Trump at all. And I find that interesting. I enjoy reading him. I met George Will once, and I said to him, I said, I really like your articles. You're very intelligent. I don't think I understand everything you said. And he looked at me and he goes, yeah, I can believe that.
I hope you took that as a compliment, Joe.
I don't know. He's a big baseball fan, that's how I met him.
Yeah, he is. Well, I really do have a big concern that we are not anywhere close to having a healing in this country. We are so hate-driven. I've never seen anything quite like the anti-Trump feelings. We have had some bad presidents, and I think that Obama was certainly one of them. But we've never had hatred like this before.
I don't think Obama can be compared to Trump. I mean, you might disagree with Obama's policies. You might disagree with some of the things.
Well,
you know,
oh yes, no, he was a much nicer talker than Trump. And I think, and you're right, Trump brought a lot of it on himself.
He still is.
How can you call the major media fake news and not expect some kind of
Right.
feedback?
Well, and also for 8 years, whatever was said was just parroted by the mainstream media. I watched some of the White House press briefings. Very seldom was Mr. Obama out there. And when, things like, well, this happened in Benghazi, or this happened over here because of a video, or this, that, the other, the press just ate that up. And nobody pushed back on it until, weeks later. To me, it has to go both ways. You have to have the same dogged persistence of the Edward Murrows and those types of people to say, listen, I don't care if you're a Republican or Democrat, you're loading me up here with a load, and I got to hear something. When Nancy Pelosi pushes back because the reporter asks her a question and she throws the guy under the bus and says, well, you're just reporting this, you're biased. And or when Jake Tapper sits there with Jill Biden and asks her a question and she says, well, we're not answering that. And he just demurs and says, oh, well, okay, we're sorry. I'm sorry for even asking you that question. That's one time I've ever seen Jake Tapper smile, was when Joe Biden called him about, he was asking a legitimate question, and this notion that somehow it's a totally different game when we're interviewing our boy than the opposition has to stop if we're going to have credibility in our news organizations.
You made an interesting
But if
comment.
you talk about pushback in questioning, look at any interview with Donald Trump when he tells the reporter, that's a stupid question, you don't know what you're talking about, you are dumb, you are fake news, you don't belong here, I refuse to answer your question. It goes on. To me, though, the biggest concern, and it's not going to get solved as far as the divisiveness, is the way the handling is of the outcome of the election. The refusal to have a peaceful transfer of power from one administration to the other is only tearing this country apart, and it's not going to help. In my mind, enough is enough. The election is over. Donald Trump lost, and there is a way to try to bring us back together, at least partially, and it's not the way he's doing it.
He has no class.
Point me to the articles where Al Gore would not concede the election, and point me to those articles that basically,
In that case, Al Gore was
there-
behind in Florida
yeah,
by 537 votes. However, Al Gore did concede, and that was challenged
It went to the
because
Supreme
it could have
Court.
affected
went to the Supreme Court in
537
December.
votes as opposed to 5
But
million, five and a
my
half
point is,
million votes.
Point
by
me
which
to those articles that dragged Al Gore through the mud because of his right to contest an election. We haven't reached that point with this, and a campaign can contest all they want, but there will be a finale to this. And whether he wins or loses, I doubt that he wins, but give the guy his day in court. And if we're not willing, if we're going to talk about the media now, if the media is not willing to give him the same deference that they gave Al Gore, and it wasn't that long ago where they were complaining that Hillary Clinton was robbed because of the Russians.
Brian, I think
we can't forget that.
I think you made your point, and we've just run out of time.
Sorry.
Thank you very much, folks. Good program.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.
Bye-bye.